If you listen to the show, you already know that we cannot exist without our sponsors. They are the ones who make things happen behind the scenes. So let's acknowledge Fuji Sports. We've been working with these guys for a while now, not only as far as this podcast is concerned, but also at the RŌL Academy. We've had their gear. I personally use their gis. What a phenomenal product.
Yeah, I mean, jiu-jitsu, judo, MMA, tape, bags, anything you need for your jiu-jitsu journey, you can find at fujisports.com.
Let's talk RŌL TV. There's so much content on there. It's ridiculous at this point. But I think what is even more intriguing, as time went on during the project, we've been recording most of the events that were taking place here at RŌL Academy. At this point, I mean, we have guys like Chris Howder, Armand Fadi, Rafael Lovato Sr., and Pete the Greek. I mean, there were so many different events that we've kind of recorded it. Don't you think that's amazing? I mean, points of reflection and kind of going back for all the students to see what really happened and refresh their memory.
Yeah, I think it's great, you know, being able to go back and look at all these high-level practitioners, Octavio Cudo, like one of the names you didn't mention. And I mean, just these guys that have been doing this for so long come in, teach these amazing seminars and workshops, and it's all recorded and there for you to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you want to get additional savings on all this, type in code RŌL Radio at the coupon and get additional 30% off of your membership.
Nice. Go to rolacademy.tv. What's up, everyone, and welcome back. If you haven't already, please hit the like, share, subscribe, download, listen, and whatever other button there is, and leave us a review wherever you do listen. This ensures that we can continue bringing you the great guests and amazing content that you've come to expect. Today's guest is one of the leading BJJ podcasters. He has taken the concepts related to his years of working in the corporate world and applied them to jiu-jitsu. Steve Kwan joins the podcast to discuss how to reframe your mindset from a negative to a positive, the pitfalls hobbyists face having access to training with the pros, why he believes technique is one of the least important things while learning jiu-jitsu, and how impactful the community of jiu-jitsu can be for students and instructors. Here's the RŌL Radio with Emily Kwok, Black Belt, and the host of the BJJ Mental Models podcast, Steve Kwan.
Welcome to RŌL Radio.
And we are live. Steve Kwan on the show. Steve, how are you,
Thomas,
sir?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, sir?
Good to see you, or good to hear from you, see you, whichever way we slicing this again. I had an opportunity to talk to you some time ago. It's been a while, right? When did we record your?
It has been
that was
a while.
like couple years ago, wasn't it?
I don't know, man. Time flies. I'd have to go back and check. But yeah, you were on BJJ Mental Models some time ago. You were talking about, as a coach, how to maximize the success of your students. Always a great topic. And so roles are reversed here. I get to be the guest today.
Yeah, I get to, pick your brain on some of the topics that you've done. But what I think was interesting about all of this, as this conversation is coming together, that we just talked to Steve, you're connecting with him very well. We just had Emily Kwok here at my academy, and I know you know her very well. So what a small world, isn't it?
Sure is. Emily is my coach. I actually was just at her place down in Costa Rica for a whole month not too long ago. And I'm going to be seeing her again, I think, next month in October. So yeah, she gives a heck of a seminar. That's actually how I met her originally, as I saw her old instructional with Stefan Kesting, and she came to town to do a seminar. And it was at that point I started to think I should probably figure out a way to train with this person.
Well, look how that worked out, right? I mean, it's interesting how one event or one person really can change the trajectory of our life and what is happening from that point on. Have you experienced that in your life?
Oh boy, the butterfly effect. I mean, that is very much the story of, I think, a lot of people's experience with jiu-jitsu. You know, we all start jiu-jitsu for whatever reason. Usually we want to learn self-defense or get in shape, or we want to train UFC or whatever. But very rarely, from my experience, is that the reason why people stick around. People stick around because of who they've met along the journey. And my jiu-jitsu journey is very much that, just a series of random happenings introduced me to some of the people now who are the closest people in my life. I met my wife at jiu-jitsu. Of course, Emily, I know her through jiu-jitsu. My brother, he got into jiu-jitsu as well. So that gives us something to talk about a lot. So yes, very much that is kind of the story of my life, is some of the weird random circumstances in jiu-jitsu have led me to those things are now kind of what I focus on. Those are the main things in my life that I operate under.
Have you ever thought about the fact what would happen if you never met Emily, and what would be the butterfly effect from there?
Not really. If I never met Emily, probably I wouldn't play as much single leg X guard, is my guess, if I weren't familiar with her. You never know how things could have turned out. I try not to get too stuck in the what if, right, of life, because it's so easy to just spend all your time wondering, well, what if I'd done something differently? And I mean, you can't have done anything differently, because the person that you are today is the result of all of the decisions you made. And if I had done something differently, I might not be who I am today. So it's kind of hard to answer that question.
But even what you're talking about right now, we are the result of post-product, or what we've done in the past, or the experiences that we've experienced. Many people don't look at it that way. Many people look at life as, it is here, it is now, and, some of them look at it negative, some of it positive. But you bring up a really good point. I mean, truly, all of the experiences, the positive and negatives, on and off the mat, especially on the mat, right? I mean, like, we go through these training sessions. We're trying to educate ourselves. We're trying to get better. I mean, that's why everybody steps on the mat. But listen, it's not a secret. Life sucks sometimes on the mat. We are the nail, and oftentimes it's not so easy. But this is what shapes us, who we are today, or that's what shaped us, all the past experiences, to what we are or who we are today, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, because I've been dealing with this myself recently. I just had my first really big serious injury. It's going to require surgery. I tore my shoulder doing something with some giant steroided blue belt, as is always the case, right?
You know those guys too, huh?
Yeah, there was this big giant guy that I didn't know and I didn't trust, and he was a blue belt, and I thought I should roll with that guy. And you know what? Lesson learned. But somehow I've managed to get all the way to this point without having a really serious injury. Of course, I've had little things, but this is the first time I'm probably going to go under the knife. And it's a struggle, right? Because you have to try to figure out, how can I frame my mindset to look at this as a positive, rather than the obvious interpretation, which is I'm losing a substantial amount of training time. It's going to cost a lot of money to get this thing fixed. But if you can kind of reframe this, and from talking to a lot of high-performing athletes, I've always been impressed at their ability to do this, to reframe these negatives into positives and find that silver lining. I'm trying to do the same, but God, it is harder when you can't train jiu-jitsu, huh?
So what is your mindset right now? I mean, you're pre-surgery stage, right? So we know it's not fixed yet. Yet you're training properly, suffering, or you might not even be training at this point at all. I mean, this is the dip. This is the lowest probably that we are in that course of that period of time when the injury occurred. What is your mindset? Like, do you want to quit right now? Are you done?
Oh God, no.
Well,
this is
many
not
do
even
think that way, don't they?
Yeah, I guess so. When you're early on in your journey, right, you have a very different perspective. I remember when I started jiu-jitsu, if something happens and I had to be off the mats for a week, I felt like, oh my God, my life is over. What am I going to do a week without jiu-jitsu? But as you get older and you take a long, it's just like getting older and more mature in life, you have a better perspective of time over a long window when you're older. I mean, when I was a kid, a month felt like forever. As a 40-something-year-old now, a month feels like, it just goes by so quickly. And it's similar in jiu-jitsu. When I started off on this journey, having to take a week off for work or injury or whatever just seemed devastating. But if you've been training long enough, as you know, Thomas, there's going to be numerous times where you have to step away from the mats for one reason or another. I mean, this is far from my first big layoff. When my daughter was born, I took a ton of time off. When the pandemic happened, I took a ton of time off. So I'm not worried about losing training time at all. I mean, once you've done this enough, you know how to kind of make the use of your time when you're off the mats. For me, of course, running BJJ Mental Models, that just gives me more time to build product and make courses and talk to people like yourself, right? So for me, being off the mats doesn't bother me as much as it used to, because I know jiu-jitsu is still going to be there when I get back.
Well, let me spin this the other way then. You might be the lucky cat who keeps your head straight. You might be just very smart guy who doesn't let the negative kind of overwhelm you. But many people out there are in the similar spots and they are like, this is not for me. First of all, I don't want to get hurt, so jiu-jitsu is not safe. Number two, this is going to suck. It's going to cost a lot of money. Like, why not pick up checkers right now? Why not go and, I don't know, go to the bar or whatever, do something else? Why we get sucked into this negative perspective when these events occur?
So I just got a fan message from someone who was asking a similar question about how do you kind of ride through the lows when things aren't going well in jiu-jitsu. And we were talking about recovering from injury. And what I said is, I mean, look, in life, it's easy to look at the risks and the downsides that can happen with everything that you can do, but there is no way to get out of this completely injury-free and completely safe, right? There is nothing that you can do that will guarantee your safety and guarantee no risk of injury. People might think, well, what if I don't do jiu-jitsu? Well, I would turn that around and say, look, if you decide that you cannot live with the risk of injury from training, and so you just sit on the couch all the time, then yeah, you're not going to get injured at jiu-jitsu, but you are guaranteed to have health issues then, right? Any sort of physical activity comes with a risk. And Brazilian jiu-jitsu is absolutely not immune to that. I mean, it is, although it is a very gentle sport in terms of what it actually is, it's still a combat sport. And something's going to happen at some point in your journey. And part of training is understanding and accepting that risk, because the real risk is doing nothing. There is a phrase I heard. So I heard someone refer to this as the Red Queen effect. It's a reference to Alice in Wonderland and the notion that you have to run forward and move forward just to stay still. And life is very much like that. You have to keep moving just to hold your place. If you stop moving and you do nothing, by default, you're going to fall behind, right? I mean, in terms of saving your money, if you're afraid of investing and you just park your money into an account where it's just sitting there, you lose by default because inflation is going to kill your money anyway. So you've traded the potential risk of investing with the guaranteed risk of losing your money to inflation. Injury and jiu-jitsu are the same thing. If you are afraid of the risk of doing jiu-jitsu, then what's the alternative? The guaranteed risk of doing nothing, having health issues, missing out on opportunities in life. So at the end of the day, modern medicine is pretty amazing. Injuries, they do happen. Of course, some people really get screwed up in jiu-jitsu. I'm not going to take away from that. There is the possibility of serious injury, but for most people, any physical activity comes with a risk, and the alternative is not good, right? So we got to do something with ourselves.
And we can take this even deeper. Any activity has or introduces the wear and tear of what we perform. I mean, you don't want to do jiu-jitsu, you go running, you probably will experience some knee conflicts. If you are a swimmer, there's probably some lung problems and shoulder problems. I mean, we can take this even deeper into, soccer or football. There are other wear and tear like events that might be occurring, which you will simply, accumulate over a period of time. And we both know that doing jiu-jitsu, for some of us, it's decades of the same activity and accumulating these wear and tear points, which then at the end of the time will result in, as we get older, it will result in some of those pain points. Yeah.
Well, that's actually what my physio suggested, is the reason I got injured was probably less to do with one specific moment and more to do with 16 years of letting lunatics try to twist my shoulder off, right? I mean, there's wear and tear, but that's also how you build strength. I mean, yes, you can accumulate injuries, but if you don't go through those activities, then you're going to wind up way weaker at the end of the day. I mean, as an example, I know people who train jiu-jitsu a lot harder than me. They're pro competitors. And I mean, in a lot of ways, their bodies are broken. They got a bunch of injuries that I don't have. But on the other hand, they're still way more athletic and in way better shape than me. So it's not just as simple as racking up injuries, right? There's also your overall performance, and it's a trade-off. Again, if you do nothing, you don't see those benefits. So like with all things in life, it is a matter of looking at the risks and making informed decisions about whether you can accept those risks.
Yeah, and would you agree that some of this also comes with being simply smart about what we do and how we do it, and not necessarily limited to jiu-jitsu, but what you just said, making smart choices? But I'm more even referring to how we train, how we approach training, how the amount of training, not even how many days, but the efficiency of training, hard days, low days, recovery points. I mean, when I look back 20 years ago, when I was starting, there was no such thing as a recovery point. There was no conversation about you need to have a rest day. No, we were going balls out every single day. Otherwise, you were not training. I mean, it is what it is. today I feel like we are much smarter than this, and we can really put some intelligence behind even hobbyist training.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And the thing I've always said is, people are way too obsessive, I think, about high performance, what goes on at the highest levels training. I mean, it's interesting to follow that stuff, but look, at the end of the day, 99% of us, that doesn't really apply directly to us. We all want to get better, but unless someone is going to tell me that they're willing to quit their job and pursue a jiu-jitsu competitive career full-time, and they happen to be a 20-something prime athlete, right? For most of us, what goes on at the highest levels is not the most relevant. On the other hand, when you are a hobbyist and you're only training a few times a week, maybe 2 times a week if you're lucky, I think at that point, training smart is actually more important because you have less time to get the results you want to get. I've always said, people obsess over like, what is the best training method for jiu-jitsu? And yeah, there's ways that you can optimize it. But look, if you are a high performance athlete and you're training every day, 6+ hours a day, you're going to get pretty damn good at jiu-jitsu no matter what. Right. I mean, at some point, yes, when you get up to the top world championship level, it becomes a matter of tiny improvements and who's got the edge here and there. But for the most part, you can get good at jiu-jitsu just by training dumb and putting in the time. But I think it's if you're a hobbyist that you see the most benefits out of training smart, because you don't have the benefit of just throwing all your time at the sport. You got maybe a few hours you're willing to commit. So how do you get the most out of those few hours? That I think is where the science of learning jiu-jitsu gets really interesting. Is not about how do we take A athletes and turn them into A+ athletes, but how do we take regular people and get them good at jiu-jitsu without making them devote their whole lives to this thing?
Let me ask you this. I had a recent conversation about something very similar, and the individual I was conversing with mentioned that jiu-jitsu is the only sport where, or one of the very few, where there is no separation between professionals and hobbyists. When you look at NFL or professional football, professional basketball, any other sport, there is these professionals who are unreachable to us. We see them on TVs. We need to wait in line for autographs. In jiu-jitsu is very different. You can go and train with Gordon Ryan or Craig Jones or Roger Gracie, anybody you want. Like, the limitation is you making the decisions to go and train, which blurs the lines of the professional, quote unquote, which now puts all of us, the hobbyists, on the same level as the professional might be, which might encourage us or gives us this desire to train as much as they do, especially if you are present in person next to them. And as a result of that is very different now, because ultimately, as you mentioned, we can't train as professionals because we don't have the time or effort, or honestly, it's just, we are just hobbyists. We just do it 2-3 times a week. What are your thoughts on this?
Rafael Lovato Jr. once yelled at me for calling myself a hobbyist. And he basically said, like, look, you're using this term that is kind of disparaging against yourself. But you've been training this for 16 years. You put a ton of time into this podcast and these educational resources. I mean, yeah, you don't compete, but jiu-jitsu is clearly something you love and you've loved for most of your life. Is it really fair to call yourself a hobbyist just because you're not a pro competitor? And I thought, well, you know what? If the greatest American grappler of all time is going to tell me not to call myself a hobbyist, then maybe I shouldn't do it. So I think there's something to be said about that. I mean, we use hobbyist kind of as a disparaging term sometimes, but maybe a better term would be something like amateur or casual grappler, right? Basically, people who are not doing this for fun. And it's not even a matter about doing it professionally. There's a lot of people who aren't pro competitors, but they still do jiu-jitsu professionally. I mean, if you run a gym, for example, or if you run a company where you sell merchandise or other equipment, are you still a hobbyist? Probably not. So it's kind of a weird label to use, and I've been trying to move away from it a bit.
All right, fair enough. Do you feel that being in the same room with some of those big names and some of those competitors that we look up to puts us in a disadvantage point because we want to be like them and they are so accessible?
Yes and no. I think that it is one of the things I see about jiu-jitsu is people are way too keen to compare themselves to what the top athletes are doing, and they beat themselves up if they're not achieving those same results. which is weird because you wouldn't see this in a lot of other sports. I actually have an episode coming up in the near future where we're going to be talking about this specifically and how, we don't really have the concept of beer league jiu-jitsu, right? There's this expectation that if you're going to be training jiu-jitsu, you need to be spending every waking moment of your life just trying to do this shit at the highest levels. And that isn't really realistic when you're a 50-year-old accountant with 3 kids who's just doing this for fun. And I think sometimes mixing those messages can cause problems, right? Because if everyone in the gym thinks they're training for the mundials, you're going to get a whole bunch of injuries because a bunch of dumb hobbyist blue belts don't know how to keep each other safe. So I think there is something to be said about that. I'm just adjusting my camera here. It's falling down a bit. I think there is something to be said about the psychological impact of having such close proximity to the pros. But the other thing that I would say, though, is when you talk to those pros, they will be the first people to tell you, like, don't worry too much about this stuff. So the fact that one of the cool things about jiu-jitsu is the fact that you can meet your heroes. You can contact and connect with the biggest names in the sport. That is a luxury you would not have in pretty much any other sport I can think of. But on the other hand, if you talk to those people, you realize real quick they're not as and I'm sure you would agree, they are not nearly as intimidating as you would be led to believe based on just their resumes alone. Most of them are just regular people who have the same kind of hang-ups as the rest of us. The only difference is they decided to be pro competitors and they happen to be good at it.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I feel like jiu-jitsu is one of the very few activities or sports, if not the only one, where that contact with professionals is so easy, and not only contact with them, it just even going and training with them. I mean, I don't know many casual basketball, players being able to train with LeBron or Michael Jordan. Like that just doesn't happen for many reasons. And in jiu-jitsu is very different. It is, we do have access to some of these guys, and you're right. A lot of them are just normal guys. They just want to hang out and talk shop and do cool stuff. So
Yep.
I feel like we are lucky on that front.
I agree. It'll be interesting to see if that changes as jiu-jitsu. I mean, I presume jiu-jitsu is going to keep growing. And I think a big reason why everyone is so accessible in this sport is because it is still such just an incredibly niche sport. We think of it as living in this jiu-jitsu bubble. I think we think of jiu-jitsu as being a lot bigger than it is. Most people out there still don't know the difference between jiu-jitsu and karate and kung fu, right? It is an extraordinarily niche sport. And I think we lose track of that. I mean, an example, right? Who are some of the biggest names in our sport? Craig Jones, Gordon Ryan, maybe John Danaher. In the grand scheme of things, these people are nobodies, right? Like there are flash in the pan, viral meme stars and reality show guests who have way bigger audiences than Gordon Ryan does, right? He's ultimately a pocket celebrity in a very, very small niche sport. So if this thing grows, I think, of course, we'll lose that. We will get to the point if this thing keeps growing where you just can't go to a seminar with Gordon anymore or train with these guys. That might just be an unavoidable aspect of growing the sport. But it is pretty cool right now that you can just reach out to your heroes, and a lot of the time they will reach out right back to you.
Well, and I think slowly we are creeping into that point that you're describing. I mean, perhaps Gordon Ryan is accessible because he's on top of that wave. But if you look at guys like Hickson Gracie or Hoyler Gracie or some of those OGs, they are not as accessible as one would think. You got to go through some hoops to even have a conversation or get a response from some of these guys. So I think we might be experiencing some of that already, what you are describing.
That is definitely true. But I would also say that those guys, kind of the more old school Gracies, I think they kind of look at they've taken more of like a business approach at this point, and they kind of put up some walls and some barriers. But yeah, I definitely agree. It tends to be hard to get a hold of them. That said, though, I mean, I've reached out to like Henner Gracie and I've shot him messages and he's responded. So
actually,
I don't know.
Henner's one of those few guys who actually responds to all of it.
Yeah.
I have the opportunity to talk to him too. So it's and we had his brother on the show. So like it's always interesting to the engagement points that we are experiencing here. Let's pivot this a little bit. Let's take this back. Let's take this back 10, 16 years ago. When did this all start? Why did this all start? Do you remember your very first day on the mats?
I sure do. I started Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in 2008. I had never really done a martial art before. I'd always been sort of martial arts curious. I remember in high school, I never liked gym class, but the one thing I really loved in gym class was wrestling. and they gave you like a 1 week unit of wrestling a year. And that I used to look forward to that every year. But for some reason, I just, you know how kids are, right? Like for some reason, I just never clicked in my head that like, oh, this is actually a thing I could do more of if I liked. I don't know why. It never occurred to me like, oh, I could actually enroll in this thing.
You waited the entire year for the 1 week, but it never occurred to you that you could do more?
For some reason, well, you know how it is when you're a kid. There's stuff coming at you, and you don't realize that you have agency over something of this. It just never occurred to me to be like, oh, there's actually a wrestling team. I could actually ask and be part of this. And I really enjoyed that. But, you know, I never got into it. And then at some point in my 20s, I really had always wanted to do a martial art. And so I spent a lot of time kind of researching what would be the best fit for me. And of course, like so many other people during that time, like yourself, I'm sure that research basically came down to watching the UFC and seeing what was going on there. And of course, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a huge part of that. And the message behind Jiu-Jitsu really spoke to me. This idea that, look, it not only do you not have to be the biggest and the strongest person, but you can defend yourself, you can protect yourself. And perhaps one of the things that was most important to me is you can protect the other person as well, right? Henner Gracie, again, has one of the quotes he said that really stuck with me is that jiu-jitsu is the only true self-defense sport or martial art. Most of the other martial arts are more like self-offense, right? I mean, if you achieve success in striking arts by trying to inflict damage on your opponent, you achieve success in judo by trying to dump someone on their head as hard as you can, right? In jiu-jitsu, it's the only sport where you can defend yourself without hurting the other person that I'm aware of, right? You're basically trying to tie them up into a pretzel to the point where they have to give up and decide it doesn't make sense to fight anymore. Philosophically, as someone who doesn't like confrontation and violence, that really appealed to me. So that's kind of how I got started at it. I had a decent idea of what to expect because I'm pretty analytical, right? I did a bunch of research, and so I went into jiu-jitsu and I knew like I'm going to get my ass handed to me, but that's part of it. So let's just go in and have fun. So I showed up on my first day. This again was back before like actually trying to put together a good training method was a thing. So they just threw me into the class and I got just beat up by a bunch of blue belts. And I thought, that's pretty cool. Let's go back and do it again. If I didn't know what I was getting into, I'm not sure I would have come back. But like I said, I'd already done my research and I knew what to expect. And so I thought, I'm just going to keep doing this thing. And I just kept doing it. And that's basically it.
You set the expectations for yourself clearly.
Yeah.
I'm going to go in.
I knew exactly what was going to happen.
Up and
yeah. It's jiu-jitsu is a lot easier if you go into it with the expectation that like, look, you're going to give as good as you get. I think where a lot of people wreck their own mindset is they feel this need to win, even when it doesn't make sense. I've sparred with white belts before. Sometimes you get so pissed off when, you know, I tap them or I catch them. And it's like, what did you think was going to happen? Like, well, really, what did you think was going to happen? Did you think some white belt off the street was going to just roll in and beat up the black belts? What would that say for the martial art if that was possible? So I think sometimes people are just way too hard on themselves, even at the senior belts. You know, you need to be accepting of losing because that's how you test your boundaries. That's how you discover new things that could work for you in the future. If you're just constantly staying in your comfort zone and doing the things that you know will get results, then you're static. You're never moving in time. You're fixed in time. You're not getting better, and everyone else around you is just going to get better. So a big part of jiu-jitsu
I gotta ask you. I mean, everything you're saying, it makes sense. Yet every time we step on the mat, we just want to beat them up. They want to beat us up. I mean, isn't it part of human nature, especially as men? We are here to fight. We are here to really, you know, outdo the other person. We are here to out-trick them and ultimately smash them because that's what we do. Why we always resort to these very simple mindsets?
I would say first and foremost, I'm not sure if that's a thing about men. Like, I know a lot of women who are scrappy as all hell. Like,
First of all, for the record, I said this before on this show, and I'll say it today. And I think women are more vicious in jiu-jitsu than guys are. Like, you know, and some of them are tough. I mean, tough.
Yeah, but I don't know if it's more vicious, but I mean, everyone's different, but I will say this, like, I train with a few women who legitimately terrify me. I know that this one black belt that I train with, she's maybe like, if I had to guess, about 120 pounds. She quite famously got jumped by two dudes and a girl at the mall one time. And by the time it was all said and done, she was fine. The girl was in the hospital and the other two dudes had run away. So I don't know if it's true that it's like a thing about being a man, but I think there is definitely a part of human psychology where if someone is up in our face, our instinct, we're going to fight, flight, or freeze, right? It's hard to avoid that instinctive response. That's part of who we are, right? Our biology was not designed to accommodate Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, right? Like that's not part of the human genome. That's something we built ourselves to be more efficient. And like with a lot of things in life, sometimes if we want to really succeed at that, we have to train ourselves out of our natural nature. And in jiu-jitsu, it is, to me, this is one of the big differences between like a brown or a black belt and the more junior belts is it takes a while to learn to be chill when someone is trying to choke you unconscious. It is very hard to do. Some people never succeed in learning that, unfortunately, but it takes a long time to kind of get over that. And of course, we say that you'll always hear people talk about how you got to kill the ego. The ego is the enemy. Look, that just isn't possible. The ego is part of what makes you human. You can't kill part of yourself like that and still function. You need to have an ego. It's more about managing that ego and having a productive relationship with it. So I think sometimes people fail to do that, but it's a counterbalance too, right? Because I guarantee you, no one's ever won a world championship without having a bit of ego. So you need
Absolutely.
that on one hand to have some drive, but on the other hand, you also need to make sure it's not making decisions on your behalf. And that's when I think you start to see issues in the training room when people they cannot accept the fact that they might lose.
At which point do you think that pivot point comes in for most people? Or perhaps when did it come in for you? When we stop thinking of, listen, I'm going to destroy them to let me see where this is going. Let me troubleshoot this situation. I'm safe here. And we're really kind of creating this, I call it maturity, Jiu-Jitsu maturity, where we can make intelligent decisions for ourselves while we are in that position.
Yeah. I don't know if there's a single point where it happens for everyone, where I don't think you could say, oh, it happens from brown belt, for example. I think for me, it kind of happened around brown or black belt. But one thing that I would say is the people who get really good at jiu-jitsu really fast, I think tend to be the ones who develop that maturity early. A lot of the just savant white belts I know, or blue belts who are just way better than you would expect them to be. One of the things that seems to tie them together, at least from my observations, is they have no trouble just going in and just focusing on learning. They're not there to necessarily win. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But the one thing that kind of holds all of their performance together is that they're okay with whatever happens, right? They're not there to rack up wins in the gym where they don't count.
Yeah, that's one of the more difficult skills to acquire in jiu-jitsu. I feel like I'm curious what you think about this. We have like these few components of what makes us successful on the mat, and physical component is definitely present. This is a physical contact sport. There is no secrets about it, but I do think that mental awareness and decision-making process that unfolds while we are training and then while we're solving that puzzle is as important, if not more important. What are your thoughts on that?
100%. The thing that I've always thought just bizarre is how it appears to me at least anyway, most jiu-jitsu gyms are 100% focused on technique. And in a lot of ways, technique is one of the least important things of jiu-jitsu. I've always been surprised that more coaches don't focus on things like mindset or general big picture training, or even talking conceptually to their students and explaining why we're doing what we're doing. So many classes, just you show up and the instructor shows you the 10 steps to the armbar, and then you roll a bit and then you leave. And I don't think that's the optimal way to learn at all. I think that we're increasingly seeing that the science doesn't agree that that's the optimal way to learn at all. I would say, man, if I wanted to build an elite performance team, one of the first things that I would do is focus on teaching my students how to network, how to find good people, get them around them, how to deal with loss, how to be resilient mentally. And most people, that's just not part of their curriculum.
Yeah, unfortunately. Why do you think that happens? If you look at other sports, it has huge presence, how to mentally approach the sport itself, or even to training, recovery, and so on. But we don't do that in jiu-jitsu.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't tell you why it is that way. I think a big part of it is just the relative immaturity and newness of the sport. We're just now starting to discover some of the things that other sports have been doing for decades or longer. Of course, jiu-jitsu also as a martial art is steeped in traditionalism. You know, people like to think of jiu-jitsu as being different from the TMAs and being more casual, and maybe sometimes that's true, but we've got our own weird traditions as well.
Oh yeah.
And I think one thing is that most instructors, they kind of just copy and try to duplicate whatever their instructor taught them. And what their instructor taught them is not necessarily a bunch of practices that are steeped in modern pedagogy or anything, right? A lot of the time it's just they teach the way they did because that's what their instructor did. And as a result, I think we see a lot of classes that are just like really focused on the minutia of technique, but not a lot on strategy or what is the actual best way for human beings to learn an activity like this.
Yeah, and do you think that slowly we are starting to unpack that box of being more strategic about this and conceptual teaching versus being so cookie cutter as it was, 10 or 20, 30 years ago?
I think so. I mean, we're definitely seeing a lot of coaches now who are looking to the other sports to see what they're doing and trying to bring those practices in. I mean, ecological dynamics, right? Everyone's talking about that right now. That's something that other sports have been doing for some time. It might be relatively new to jiu-jitsu in terms of the terminology, but it's not a new concept, right? And so I think that as jiu-jitsu matures, a big part of what we'll do is grab lessons from other sports, study those and see what works and try to duplicate them here.
Is this the path for jiu-jitsu to be professional sport, or
I don't know. I mean, what does professional mean, right? Like, what's the goal there? Are we talking about getting it into the Olympics? I mean, what do you mean by professional?
Don't start me on that. I have my feelings about that topic, but but it's like, look, everybody talks about we want jiu-jitsu to grow. We need to grow jiu-jitsu. Jiu-jitsu needs to get bigger and this and that, right? And even you said just a couple weekends ago, we had Craig Jones did his thing and ADCC did his thing. Big rivalry there, but all that draws attention to jiu-jitsu, to grappling in general, right? So like we want it to grow. I don't think there's one person in jiu-jitsu who doesn't want jiu-jitsu to be bigger. Yet I feel like we often ignore or even refuse to look at this from a smart perspective. How do we get smart about this? How do we be more efficient about this? Like there has to be a better way to teach students than what we are doing today. And I feel like oftentimes we are almost stubborn about being stuck in our own old ways.
I would agree to some extent. I mean, personally for me, I don't need to see jiu-jitsu get gigantic. I mean, on one hand, it would be kind of cool, but I don't need to see jiu-jitsu in the Olympics to be happy. I mean, it might always wind up being a niche sport. I would be surprised if it ever got bigger than MMA, for example. And I think to some extent, we're going to have to be okay with that. There's the possibility that jiu-jitsu might just always be this kind of like weird fringe offshoot martial art that's really popular with one group, but it just does. Maybe it's got a ceiling and it never goes beyond that. I'm at peace with that. I'm fine with that. I think that already it's plenty big. There's a lot of people who do it. The big thing that I always care about is, okay, can people actually make money off of this sport? Is there actually a career path, a way for people to, build a life around this? That to me is, I think, more important. I don't want a situation where people are broke because they do jiu-jitsu for a living. And I think the good news is there's a lot of opportunity there already. I mean, there are many, many people who successfully run jiu-jitsu gyms. The competition scene is a bit different, but look, if we're being honest, it's hard in any sport to make money as a pro competitor. Jiu-jitsu is not unique in that regard. If you want to make a lot of money in life, trying to be a professional athlete is probably one of the worst choices that you can make, right? Statistically speaking. So I'm not even too worried about the competitors and what they do. The question is, though, for people who do really like jiu-jitsu, is there a path to make a living out of it? I think there is. And I think in that sense, we can say that there already is a professional aspect of jiu-jitsu.
Do you think it's going to get bigger? Do you think that jiu-jitsu will actually grow to a service like a division where this is pretty common, where you go to the jiu-jitsu, you can get a job, you can go to Jiu-Jitsu Academy, you can get a job, you can continue growing within that pillar, within that facility? Do you foresee that being that accessible to that point, or will Jiu-Jitsu Academies remain more of a little niche, here's a little mom and pop shop? How do you envision that 20 years from now?
It's a good question. I'm not sure I can predict anything that far out, but I will say that the one thing about jiu-jitsu that's very interesting is it touches a kind of a demographic that not many other combat sports can touch. I mean, how many 60-year-old wrestlers do you see who still go to wrestling practice every day? I've met one in my life, right? With a lot of other sports, people drop off as they get older. But one of the things about jiu-jitsu is that you can practice it well into your later years. Jiu-jitsu is very customizable. You can make jiu-jitsu whatever you want it to be, which is one of the things that I love about it. There's so much room for self-expression. And because of that, it's very feasible for people 60, 70, even beyond to keep training in some capacity. That's something that jiu-jitsu has that very few other sports have. And so I think there is the possibility that jiu-jitsu could become a real big thing. But I think that where it would grow is not necessarily like big competitive scenes. I don't think it's ever going to get to the point where people watch the ADCC like they watch the Super Bowl. But as an activity, kind of like yoga or surfing, as a kind of a wellness lifestyle thing, I could absolutely see it keep growing. And that's probably honestly where most of the money is. So I would be excited about that, right? Someone that I know and respect greatly, Jeff Shaw, the head coach of Bellingham BJJ, has always said that he thinks jiu-jitsu has the potential to be kind of like the anchor store in your downtown square, right? You know how when you're doing, you look at how your city is planned out, they've got anchor businesses like a coffee shop or whatever. And the idea is everyone just goes there. It's kind of one of the pillars of the community. Jeff has always maintained that why can't a jiu-jitsu place be like that? And I think that's a cool approach. I could see jiu-jitsu becoming kind of the thing that ties the community together. I could see it becoming a really popular sport from a wellness perspective. And I think all of that can be done without the competition scene growing or getting any bigger.
Isn't it interesting how this jiu-jitsu thing that we love touches so many different areas of life? You just mentioned community. We talk about professional sport. We're talking about amateur or hobbyist, however you want to name that. We talk about recovery. We talk about fitness. We talk about mental health. I mean, isn't it mind-blowing how it touches so many different areas of our life, and it's just like coexists next to us, or we coexist within it?
Yeah, on one hand, I hate to be that like woo-woo jiu-jitsu saved my life guy who oversells the benefits of jiu-jitsu. I've always found that it's like, oh God, that's a bit cringy. But you know what? It's absolutely true. One of my coaches, Sean Albrecht, once said that the longer you train jiu-jitsu, the more you realize it's not about the actual jiu-jitsu. And at first, when he said that, I thought, okay, that's just one of those like dumb jiu-jitsu quotes that old black belts say to try to sound smart. But it's actually true. Like the longer you train, the less you're going to care about the actual jiu-jitsu, like the technique and the performance. And the more
jiu-jitsu,
and the more you care about the things around it and what you can bring to it. And I've very much been kind of struggling with that transition myself as I get older, because there's a part of me that, I got into jiu-jitsu because I wanted to perform, right? When I was 20, I was obsessed about like, how can I get better at this? But as I get older, I mean, first of all, I'm getting older, so it's harder to perform, but also on top of that, the less and less I care about the actual performance. I mean, it's funny. I was talking to, I think this is actually the same conversation with Lovato, where I was saying that, like, I've come to terms with the fact that, like, if something happened and I could never train jiu-jitsu again, I would actually be okay with that, as long as I could find ways to continue to provide value in the jiu-jitsu community. If, on the other hand, you told me I could never do BJJ Mental Models again, that would be unacceptable to me. Like, I think I'm more attached to the community side of things than I actually am the individual performance side of things. I mean, if I never armbar someone again, whatever, right? I mean, it's just pajama wrestling. But jiu-jitsu is such a good tool for networking and self-development, and it's got a lot of potential, I think. I mean, I'm always hesitant to make big sweeping claims because the evidence isn't there, and we have to acknowledge that. It's not like someone has actually done some massively complicated double-blind study on this weird niche sport. So I always hate to go out and say jiu-jitsu is absolutely great for your mental health, because I can't prove that. But most people anecdotally that you talk to will tell you stories about the differences had in their lives, myself included. So I think that's the part of jiu-jitsu that interests me more. And I do think that is a natural part of the journey, that the longer you train, the less you're going to care about the actual on-the-ground grappling, and the more you're going to care about the community and how you can serve the people in those community.
Could this be the reason why so many of us stick around for so long, in a sense of, the jiu-jitsu, the act of doing jiu-jitsu, it's complicated, it's hard, it's physically demanding, wear and tear. But that community, that brotherhood or sisterhood, or this bond that we create within performing that act now gets stronger and stronger as time goes on. And that ultimately what keeps us around, not necessarily us pounding each other.
100%. Yeah, I agree completely. I think it is the relationships we build that ultimately keep us to jiu-jitsu. Reminds me of, one of the most common questions that people have in jiu-jitsu is like, I think I need to leave my gym, but I'm really struggling with it. I want to leave my gym, but I just, maybe the gym even sucks, right? Maybe it's like the instructor's a jerk to me and the instruction is awful, but still I'm really struggling with this decision. And on its face, that is kind of crazy when you think about it, right?
Yep.
I mean, imagine I always bring up this example, but imagine going to Starbucks and you don't like the coffee. So you're like obsessing over should I leave the
music
Starbucks?
was good.
Yeah, it's like I'm emotionally distraught that I might not want to go to Starbucks anymore. It's ridiculous, right? This is ultimately, the end of the day, this is a business, right? Your jiu-jitsu coach is like a personal trainer. You're there to get exercise. If you're being completely rational about it, there's no reason to be worried about leaving a gym. It's like, it's a business. Just go if you're not happy. But there's something about jiu-jitsu that makes that decision really hard for people to leave, even if it's an awful gym. And I think that reason is that it integrates with your identity. So much of your community and the people that you know come from jiu-jitsu. And so you're not just leaving the gym, you're leaving your tribe. And that's why I think it's so hard for people to leave their gym. So yes, I agree with you. The actual jiu-jitsu on the ground, I think, pales in comparison to the relationships that you develop through jiu-jitsu and the way that it impacts you personally, other than the training.
Yeah, and I think that's two-way street. You're speaking about the student, but I think it's not any easier for the instructor. Like sometimes, we invest a lot of time into these students, and yes, it is business. You're getting paid for this. Like the emotional attachment should not even exist. Like it is what it is. Yet when there is a reason, and this actually happened to me recently, one of my students moved out of state, and like,
it's hard.
I understand. I'm an adult. I can process that information, but I was genuinely down. Like I felt like it was crappy that he has to leave, and like this is almost unlogical in that sense.
Yeah.
And it's so crazy.
I can give you a kind of a comparison. When I'm working at like a day job, in the real world, often people come and go, right? Maybe your customer leaves or your teammates quit or whatever, and it's like, whatever, right? It's a fact of life. If my buddy wants to quit and go work at a different job, I'm not going to lose sleep over it. Yeah. But in the jiu-jitsu space, if people leave or quit, it takes something out of you. Like, I mean, in our community, right? For our BJJ Mental Models premium subscribers, sometimes like if someone cancels, I'm like, oh God, that actually really upsets me because I really like that person. And it's like, what did I do? And it's ridiculous because a lot of these people, I've never even met personally, but I feel attached to them because they're part of my jiu-jitsu tribe. And I think this is a reason why coaches sometimes struggle so much. You see this all over the internet, right? Where someone tries to leave a gym and their coach throws a conniption about it and it comes across as really unprofessional, and it is. But I can also understand it from the coach's perspective, right? You've invested a lot in this person, not just in terms of like a service that we've exchanged where you paid me and I trained you, but I thought we bonded over these years. And then when someone leaves, it's hard sometimes for the coach to look at that as just a business transaction, even though they probably should. At some point, we are still human beings. And if you've integrated this person into your tribe, you might feel now like they're abandoning you, even if honestly, this was just a business transaction and it was completely reasonable for them to leave for whatever reason. But I think sometimes coaches get their emotions very invested in their students, which again is completely understandable. That's part of what jiu-jitsu does to us.
Yeah, it's such an interesting environment, right? Do you think that these coaches, there are some coaches out there, and we often talked about topic, is where they don't allow other students to go and train in other places. Like the cross training doesn't even exist. It's not even a topic of conversation. Could that be a part of their reasoning why they are so territorial about this? So to protect themselves in a sense of
I think so.
students leaving?
I think so. I mean, of course, a lot of it's financial, right? It's people are trying to prevent their competitors from succeeding, and they're kind of taking a crappy way to approach that. I mean, I am a big fan of cross training. If a gym told me I couldn't cross train, then I wouldn't train at that gym. I don't think there's really any acceptable reason that I can think of for a coach to ban that kind of training. I also don't think it's the within the purview of a coach to even be able to suggest such a thing, right? If you're a grown adult, then you train where you want. Your coach shouldn't be able to tell you. But in terms of why coaches do that, yeah, I think a big part of it is this feeling of connection, right? When you hear this a lot, where someone leaves a gym and then the coach freaks out and goes on to lectures about the importance of loyalty and stuff. Well, that's maybe not the best and most productive way to approach things, but the reason why is because the coach looked at this as more than a business transaction, and they feel like they lost a friend. That's not the right mindset to have if you want to be a business professional, but as a human, I can understand why coaches do that. When coaches freak out about stuff like this, about their students leaving, I don't think it's always about money. I think a lot of it is about they're getting the business relationship mixed up with the personal relationship, and they feel betrayed.
But don't you think that in some sense, this entire conversation is almost like you can't have a cake and eat it? From one side, we want to create strong community. From one side, we want to create this bond, this trust. We put our life in their hands. Yet, on the flip side, we are saying, listen, there shouldn't be any emotional attachment here. If I want to train somewhere, I can go train somewhere. If I want to leave, I can leave. Yet, we struggle with leaving because we are attached. And it's like almost what came first, chicken or an egg? And it's like never-ending conversation. And I feel like we've been talking about this for literally 20 years. As long as I've been on the mat, that conversation has been present. And nobody's solving this problem.
Yeah.
How do you feel about this?
I mean, the reality is that human beings are complicated and contradictory, right? Being a walking bag of contradictions is a big part about being human. And we're not always rational, even though I know most of us think of ourselves as rational and we want to be rational. But at the end of the day, we are the product of millions of years of evolved behavior, which is not based on rational thought entirely. A lot of it is just emotions and what's happening to my tribe and how can I protect myself. And as much as we want to be rational, we can't deny our inner nature entirely. That's part of who we are. So yes, as a business owner, it makes sense to run things like a business. We know, rationally speaking, that it's in everyone's best interests if students can cross-train, right? But that's still going to hurt your feelings if your student goes and cross-trains across the street and tries the other guy and says, you know what, I like him better. I'm canceling my membership with you. Technically speaking, that's completely rational behavior from everyone involved, right? That's just the market doing what it does. There's really no reason to get upset about that. But as a human, it is almost impossible not to get at least a little bit upset about that. So I don't know if this can be resolved because a lot of it is human nature, right? We've got the pieces of us that want to be like calculators, where we try to use logic and reason and rationality to make decisions. But then we've also got instinct and intuition and feelings and social community and all of these other things that aren't always rational. So I don't know if it's a problem that can be solved. Honestly, I think that problem is just being human.
Yeah, you might be right on that. This might carry on for another decade or two, way past the time that you and I are training. But it always creates an interesting environment. And I think what's important to say about all of this is that, we all make mistakes. Everybody, it's just, we are just humans and how we react to them. And I think this is what really brings it back to jiu-jitsu for me. It's the life is almost like this troubleshooting game constantly. Obstacles will arise, things will come up. Most of them are out of our control, and how we react to them is really what will dictate the direction where this is going to go next. Jiu-jitsu not much different, is it?
Yeah, jiu-jitsu is kind of it's like a little laboratory where you can experiment with ideas and tactics, and more of it than you would expect is transferable to the real world. This is actually why I started BJJ Mental Models, is because I realized that there was a lot more in common with how I'd make decisions out in the real world and how I'd make decisions on the mat than maybe I initially thought. I mean, sure, in the real world, you're not doing like flying arm bars on people. At least I presume you're not. But a lot of the ways that you would make decisions under stress, interact with people around you, deal with the unexpected, some of the general concepts are the same. I mean, if you asked me to give you general advice on how to plan out and build a business, and you also asked me to give general advice on how to plan out and build a jiu-jitsu game plan, if you remove the specifics, most of what I would suggest would be basically the same. So yeah, I think that is one thing that kind of brings people into jiu-jitsu and keeps them there, is this realization that it's kind of this cool little laboratory for testing the way you think and testing how resilient you can be under pressure. And I think most people who train for an extended period of time, they eventually get to the point where they realize, I'm probably never going to need to use like an arm bar in a street fight. Maybe the reason I came here, that's never actually going to materialize, right? I'll never need to use the self-defense aspect that brought me to this in the first place. But all of the networking and communication and resilience skills and even learning skills that I learned in jiu-jitsu, those I absolutely can take with me everywhere I go. I mean, I use jiu-jitsu pretty much every day in my life, but not in terms of actual grappling, just in terms of the lessons I've learned on the mats in terms of how to deal with pressure and make good decisions. I can use those anywhere.
I love it. I love it. As I was getting ready for this conversation, I was reading about different things and listening to some of the interviews that you've done in the past. There was one that really stuck with me, or a phrase that you used, that consistency is the core of what jiu-jitsu really needs or is. Talk to me about that. Consistency is such a specific yet vague phrase, oftentimes misunderstood by many students. What is your interpretation of this as we talk about the mental approach to jiu-jitsu?
Oh, I'm glad you brought this up. I'm actually going to do a whole episode on this at some point in the future. Consistency as a concept is tremendously important for anything, right? Talent, skill, everything else, intensity, how fast you learn. I mean, these things matter, but all of that is built on a foundation of consistency. Yes, if you have two people who are like both really consistent and one of them is just an incredible athlete, they might wind up with some advantages. But normally, the main thing that dictates whether someone is going to succeed or fail is how consistent they are. But that raises the question of, what does consistency mean, right? People sometimes think that means I need to train every single day. Well, not necessarily, right? I've thought about this quite a bit, and an example that stood out with me is something that a lesson that sometimes gets taught in meditation practice. When people think of meditation, right, what they're often thinking of is like, it's about being focused on my breathing or something. And so they're thinking, as if my mind drifts off while I'm trying to meditate, that means I failed, I did it wrong. And so a common problem people have when they're doing things like awareness training or meditation training is they get frustrated, because they're trying to focus on their breathing and then they start thinking about the groceries or whatever, right? Like their mind wanders and they think that means they did it wrong, but they didn't. Consistency is not about like, I'm always able to focus on my breathing or whatever my goal is. Consistency is about, when I go off my track, I bring myself back. That's all it is. And this is something the meditation coaches will say. Like, it's not about how much time, what percentage of time you spent properly meditating. And it's not about whether you had intrusive thoughts or thought about something else. It's about, when your mind did drift off, did you bring it back to the present moment? And I think that's very much the same with jiu-jitsu or any skill development, right? We all have flurries of genius where we just have incredible performances or incredible weeks. And we all have times where, honestly, we underperform and we probably could have done better. And we're all going to have times where we're training really intensely. And we're also going to have times where we have to take time off. To me, that's not what consistency is. Consistency is, when I do leave, do I have the discipline and the motivation to come back? Can I bring myself back? And that's why things like layoffs don't bother me that much anymore, right? Because I know, look, I might have to take a long time off. I mean, with this shoulder injury, I'm probably going to have to take a year plus off of like full contact sparring, but I know I'm going to come back. There's no doubt about that. And I know that while I'm off, I'm going to be doing things like this chat. I'm going to be looking at other ways to kind of build up my skill set. So I know I will be consistent no matter what. And that to me is what consistency is. It's not about like what percentage of time you spend in the optimal flow state. It is about, when I go off track, am I able to consistently bring myself back onto the track? Can I return to practice? Can I return to form? That's how I would define consistency. Does that make sense?
Well, then tell me, Steve, why this is so difficult for so many people. I mean, this sounds very simple. It's like it's not about how many times we train. It's just knowing that you're going to come back and figure out a plan how to return if something happens, if we need to take a break or perhaps life happens. How do we come back? How do we return? Yet this is not so simple.
I think the reality is, like, when someone doesn't come back, what they're often saying is that one way or another is that this is not their highest priority. And I think that's completely fair, right? I don't begrudge anyone for quitting jujitsu because something else came up that's more important. People always talk about how jujitsu is for everyone. And I don't know if that's entirely true. Like, there's a lot of people who try jujitsu and they're like, it's cool, but I just don't like it. Or maybe they do it for a while and they do like it, and then at some point they just lose their love for it. That's normal. I don't think it makes sense to hold that against a person because they drifted away. Like, there's a difference between I really do want to do this, but I've got like a mental block and I'm afraid or something like that. That's different from, look, if I'm just being honest, I want to do other things. And so I think that if people really do want to be consistent, they will find a way to, but there are always going to be people who just, for whatever reason, they stop training. Maybe it be because they tried it once and they didn't like it, or maybe jujitsu was just a phase of their life that they went through. And I'm okay with that, right? I think that I don't think we can hold people here longer than they want to be held here. If people have made the decision, whether explicitly or not, to move on, I think that's fine, right? For some of us, jujitsu is going to be a thing we do to the day we die. For some of us, it's going to be something we do for 5 years.
And I agree with you 100%. I mean, once the decision is made, it is what it is. I don't think anybody's convincing anybody to change their mind. At the same time, I think the priority factor that you're mentioning is so important. But I guess I'm curious why a lot of people don't admit that. They're not verbalizing that. They're not saying, hey, listen, I just lost interest. Hey, listen, this is just not important to me. This doesn't tick me anymore the same way. Most of the time we get reasonings like, I'll be back. I'm just taking 7 years off, I'll be back, wouldn't you agree? Like, it's hard to admit the fact that we just shifted away from this.
Yeah, and I don't know why that is. It could be because people look at that as quitting, right? And so much of jiu-jitsu culture is about crapping on people who do this. And that might be part of it, right? Because if you're leaving, that your coach is going to judge you. Or at least maybe you think they will. Honestly, though, this is the same with anything. It's not a jiu-jitsu thing. Like, if I have a relationship with a personal trainer and then I decide I don't want to work with them anymore, it's going to be hard for me to admit that I'm quitting there too, right? No one likes to admit that they're quitting, even though quitting is often a sign of good decision-making. Like, quitting is not always a bad thing. Sometimes it makes sense to quit. And it's okay to do that. And I think we should normalize those conversations. I think sometimes people do lie to themselves, where they say, oh, I'm not really quitting, but really they've made up the decision. And I think that it's okay to normalize that, look, jiu-jitsu is not a lifestyle for everyone. For the people who stick around with this to black belt, I mean, probably it is a lifestyle. But the one thing that I've observed is people who get into jiu-jitsu and make it like the cornerstone of their lives, they really have trouble understanding what it's like to not be like that. They have trouble empathizing with people who are in a different situation or have different life goals. I remember one time a guy was trying to convince me to come join his gym. And I said, no, I'm not interested. Right. And he said, well, Steve, if you don't join our gym, you will never have what it takes to be at the top of the podium. That if you to be the best at jiu-jitsu and to be the best competitor, you have to come train with us. And I'm thinking, like, okay, you've already demonstrated right there why I am not going to come train with you, because you have no interest in looking at things from my perspective. I am a 16-year-old black belt, or 16-year black belt. I have never competed. Competition is not what brings me joy in jiu-jitsu, and I never will. It's just not what I want to do. So you're projecting your jiu-jitsu goals onto me, and we just have a fundamental mismatch. So I'm not training here. And I think that's a very common problem in jiu-jitsu, where coaches try to take what their goals are and their lifestyle is and project that onto their students, and not understand that, look, everyone has different goals. Not everyone wants to do what you've done with your life. Not everyone looks at running a jiu-jitsu gym as this amazing thing, right? For a lot of people, they would never want to do that. So I think that the big thing I would suggest is coaches need to empathize more with other people, understand that, like, not everyone walks the same jiu-jitsu journey. We don't all have the same goals. And you can't just impress your goals upon all of your students and expect them to stay.
You beat me to it, because I was about to say that that's what separates phenomenal instructor and coaches from everybody else, is that fact of empathy and not looking at what I want you to do, but how can I help you doing with what you want. It's a huge pivot point, and I think that separation, that gap, is being created bigger and bigger as time goes on, especially with sport and jiu-jitsu growing so fast. Like, this is where we see some of those very clicky-like academies where some of these enforcements are being made versus some of these more open-minded and, you know, I don't even know the term I'm looking for here, but you know what I mean. It's that separation takes place, I think, right in front of our eyes.
Yeah, yeah. I think if you're a really good coach, I mean, you should be able to take a really good competitive athlete and help them get to achieve their goals, but you should also be able to take just a casual practitioner who's maybe not even very good at this and also help them achieve their goals. People are so focused on the like the highest levels of the sport, but there's a bit of a survivorship bias there, and a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, if you are a coach who's developed a reputation for being a good competitive coach, then other good competitors are going to gravitate towards you, and they're going to be more likely to win because they're already good. So if you see a coach out there who is constantly coaching the best, I'm not even sure that necessarily means they're always guaranteed to be great. I mean, I want to know, can that coach also just take a regular person and guide them through jiu-jitsu? I mean, if all you're able to do is take someone who's already an ace athlete and just help them continue to be an ace athlete, I don't think that speaks as well for your coaching as someone who can take a broad spectrum of diverse people with diverse goals and help them all. That, to me, is what a good coach can do.
And there's another factor behind all of this, that not every coach can help everybody from just a educational perspective. Like, we were talking to Steve Kwan, who's a phenomenal judo coach, Olympian and so on. And you know what he was saying, if you look at education, schooling, you have one teacher for first grade, another teacher for second and third and so on, and it goes on. And the child gets passed on from one to another to another. None of those teachers try to hold on or slow them down because they understand this is part of the system. Yet in jiu-jitsu, we try to hold on to the students for dear life. We don't want to let them go. And it's like, it's such a, you know, I feel like we should be looking at it from the other perspective. It's my job to make you better, which means if I'm not the guy, then we shouldn't pretend I'm the guy. I should set you for success and perhaps recommend where you need to be, what you need to do to be better, because there might be people who are better than me to help you.
Absolutely. And again, the other thing you touched on there is not just handing off to a better expert or a better coach, but also understanding that one coach is often not enough. If we're building a true team, we need to all have our role on that team and have our strengths and be willing to pass the ball to the other person when it's their turn to play to their strengths. And a common issue with so many instructors, and this might be a side effect of the whole like black belt culture thing, is just instructors feel like they're expected to know everything. And it can be very hard for an instructor wearing a black belt to stand up in front of a room of 30 people and say, I don't know this.
I don't know the answer. Yep.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, though, you do that once and then you realize, oh, actually, this isn't that scary. And it never becomes a problem again. Like the first time you go up in front of a class and you say, hey, I don't know, you've normalized the pursuit of knowledge and no one's ever going to judge you for it. But it feels, before you do that, it feels like this is the worst thing as a coach I can do, is to admit that I don't know. But that's actually one of the best things that you can do, because that's how you begin the process of finding the experts who can help you. I deal with this a lot on mental models, right? I am, fundamentally a hobbyist. If I have any value, it is trying to distill complex ideas into something simpler and help present them to people in a way that resonates at a conceptual level. But that's just one thing. I mean, there's a lot of jiu-jitsu that I would absolutely not be the right coach on, especially if you have a very specific technical question. My focus is so much at the kind of like high level conceptual side of things that I sometimes struggle to map it down to individual specific details. But there's coaches who do, right? Like if you are trying to troubleshoot a berimbolo and there's like you're like 90% of the way there, but you just feel like there's one detail missing, I am not the guy to help you with that, right? And I think that a good coach will help you understand that and will point you to the people who are. I also think that a good coaching team, I think that a good coaching team, a sign of such a thing is there isn't just one coach who's like the expert in everything, but maybe there's a group of people and they all share duties and all have their own area of expertise where they shine.
Well, and again, if you look at other sports, the more developed sports that have been around for a very long time, what you're describing is just everyday routine. There's not one person running the show. There's a whole team running, and everybody has their own job, their own function, putting right people in right seats so everybody can succeed versus limiting and dividing people. And I think with all of this, we have so much room to growth. As an art, as a sport, as even as a hobbyist, as a jiu-jitsu professors, as instructors, coaches, and motivators, and there's so much more room that we can really grow and improve ourselves. So much ahead of us. Steve, we've been at this for well over an hour right now. Before we start wrapping this up, what I do every episode, I have a question from a previous guest.
Oh,
but she didn't know who's going to answer it. So think of it as question and blind, and I'll ask you to do the same thing when we
Emily
finish. So I'll ask you to do the same thing when we finish the episode. But we had the new ADCC champion on the show. Adele was here.
Daddy's home.
Daddy was here, and her question to you was, and again, she didn't know that you're going to be the one.
Oh God.
Her question to you was, if you had 3 genie wishes, what would they be? And again, just to define the rules,
damn, that's
it
3
cannot
questions.
impact love. You cannot kill anybody, and you cannot revert anything back.
Okay. I guess one thing that I really wish is that people in general would focus on trying to unite and come together rather than trying to tribalize. That's one thing that I think is really the root of a lot of the problems we have in society today. A big part of that is probably social media. It creates this artificial barrier between us that makes it hard for us to become a human. I wish we could get back to the point where we could just have, kind of reasonable civil conversations and it wasn't a big deal. I wish that everyone were able to, achieve their goals and live kind of like a stable life. I don't think people understand what a difference that makes when you have a foundation of stability, right? If you can't pay the bills, everything falls apart. It's impossible to succeed. I wish that everyone at least had that kind of base level of support so that they could focus on their passions and focus on really adding value and not worry just about survival. And I guess the other thing is I wish that no one in jiu-jitsu would ever get injured, because then we could just always train all the time and we'd have nothing to worry about. It would just be a giant playground, a giant ball pit. So there you go.
Those
are my 3 wishes.
Ask, but I'm with you there. I'm with you there.
And I'd like that wish to retroactively apply to about a year ago so that my shoulder wouldn't get injured as well.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah.
Well, Steve, it's been phenomenal chat with you. I appreciate you stepping up, stepping on the show and just sharing your thoughts, your journey, your wisdom through all the experiences that you've experienced in the past 16 years on the mat. So I truly, truly appreciate it. If somebody has been living under the rock and they have no idea who you are or what you do, briefly, where can anybody find you? How they can connect with you? How do we nail this into one spot?
Sure. So everything that we do lives at bjjmentalmodels.com. That's the first place that I would recommend people go if they want to learn more about us. In terms of what BJJ Mental Models is, it's a variety of things, but what we're probably best known for is one of what I believe to be the world's most popular jiu-jitsu education podcasts. I always emphasize that because there are so many different slants that you can take with the jiu-jitsu podcast. For us, every episode is intended to be an educational lesson that's timeless, can be deployed anywhere at any time. So if you're looking to kind of learn more about the conceptual approach to jiu-jitsu, that I'm really proud of the resource that we've got. We just crossed 300 episodes, so there's a ton of material there. We're also pretty famous for our newsletter. As of this writing, it's got, I think, about 12,000 subscribers. It's quickly becoming one of the more popular newsletters in the sport. And the same kind of general approach. We expand upon concepts that we talk about on the show. So a lot of conceptual, high-level thought. We don't spend a lot of time talking about individual techniques. Everyone else does such a great job of that. I just don't feel like there's a need for us to do it. Those are kind of the main things that we're known for. We've also got a database of all of the concepts that we discuss on the show. So if you want an encyclopedia of mental models for jiu-jitsu, again, all of that lives at bjjmentalmodels.com. All of that is completely free, no advertisements. The way that we pay the bills is through our premium service. And people who join premium, they get access to a massive library of jiu-jitsu audio courses on strategy, tactics, concepts. We try to get the best coaches and athletes in the world to present those. So some of the people who have courses on our platform are Claudio Duvall, Rafael Lovato Jr., John Thomas, Andrew Wiltsey, Rob Bernacki, Margot Ciccarelli, Brianna St. Marie. Probably Adele actually is going to be doing one with us shortly as well. So we're always looking to expand that. And also we offer direct coaching. So we've got one of what I believe to be the best online review team in the world. So if you're looking for extended jiu-jitsu coaching, and the reason I suggest this is like, look, no matter how good your instructor is, in a 1-hour class with 30 people in the room, there is only so much time that your instructor can give to you directly. And there's only so much they can troubleshoot watching you do a live roll. So the way that our service works is people can submit like a clip to us, whether it be comp footage or just footage in the gym, and we'll get a high-level black belt to break it down and review it. And when I say high-level black belt, like I'm literally talking about some of the best in the world. Some of the people on our team are Emily Kwok, you mentioned, is a reviewer of ours. Brianna St. Marie, Margot Ciccarelli, Drew Foster, in general, Josh McKinney. We got about 10 plus black belts who do this service. And again, if you want a like world champion to provide direct feedback to your dumb white belt ass, this is probably the best way to do it. People have told me it's a game-changing service, so I definitely recommend that. And again, to keep it short, everything we make lives at bjjmentalmodels.com. So go there if you want to learn more.
We'll put all the links in the show notes of this episode. So if you guys are interested in connecting with Steve, please do. Please follow him on social media. Please visit his website. Steve, thanks for being here. Thanks for this conversation. What a mind-blowing approach to jiu-jitsu and life. I appreciate what you do at Mental Models. I believe that if more people had similar approaches you do, life would be much different. Jiu-jitsu would be much different. I think we need more people like you. So thank you for hanging out with me. Thank you for doing what you do.
You're most welcome, sir. Thank you very much. It was great to be here.
Thank you for listening to RŌL Radio. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to leave us a review and help us make the show even more amazing. For future episodes, check out our website and follow us on all major podcast platforms. Take care.